The Unforeseen Foe by Nathaniel Bishop. In the sweltering heat of a Tennessee summer, Private Josiah Harker crouched behind a weathered oak fence. At 19, he was barely more than a boy, his lanky frame ill-suited to the rigors of war. The air hung heavy with the scent of smoke and earth, a constant reminder of the conflict that had engulfed the nation. The battle had been raging since dawn, a chaotic dance of blue and gray across the rolling hills of eastern Tennessee. Josiah's regiment, the 4th Tennessee Infantry, had been holding their position steadfastly, facing repeated Union advances. The ground trembled with each distant artillery burst, the vibrations resonating through Josiah's body like the rumble of an approaching storm. As Josiah peered over his shelter, his eyes, once bright with youthful enthusiasm, now reflected the harsh realities of war. The field before him was a testament to the day's struggles, littered with discarded equipment and the aftermath of conflict. The sight made his stomach churn, a stark reminder of the gravity of their situation. "Harker, keep your wits about you." The gruff voice of Sergeant Obadiah Grint cut through the din of battle. "They'll be coming again any minute now." Grint, a weathered veteran of 40-odd years, had taken Josiah under his wing when the boy first joined the regiment. His face, half hidden beneath a scraggly beard, was set in a permanent scowl that belied his concern for the men under his command. Josiah nodded quickly, forcing himself to focus. He had learned early on that Grint's bark was far worse than his bite, but the old soldier's words always carried weight. As if on cue, a cry went up from further down the line. Union forces approaching from the east. The air was suddenly filled with the crackle of gunfire as the Union forces launched another assault. Josiah's hands steadied as he took aim, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought failed. The kick of the rifle against his shoulder was a familiar sensation as he fired, then reloaded with practiced efficiency. Time seemed to lose all meaning as the battle raged on. Josiah's actions became mechanical, divorced from the chaos around him. The once verdant field had become a churned mess of mud and spent cartridges. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting long shadows across the field, the Union forces finally withdrew. A ragged cheer went up from the Confederate lines, quickly hushed by the officers who knew all too well that tomorrow would bring more of the same. Josiah slumped against the fence, his body trembling with exhaustion. He barely registered Grint's approach until the older man's hand clasped his shoulder, the weight of it both reassuring and burdensome. "You held strong today, boy," Grint said, his voice gruff but tinged with something akin to pride. "Now get some rest. We've got a long night ahead of us." As Josiah nodded wearily, his gaze drifted across the battlefield. In the fading light, he could see small groups of men moving among the fallen, their purpose grim but necessary. The sight stirred something deep within him. A question that had been lurking in the recesses of his mind for months now rose unbidden to his lips. "Sergeant," he began hesitantly, his voice barely above a whisper, "do you ever wonder, is all this worth it?" Grint's eyes, usually hard as flint, softened for a moment. He looked out over the scene before them, then back at Josiah. The young private could see a flicker of doubt cross the sergeant's face, quickly masked by the stoic expression of a man who had long ago learned to bury his emotions. "That's a weighty question, boy," he said softly, his words carried away by the evening breeze. "Best keep such thoughts to yourself. We've got a job to do, and that's all there is to it." With that, Grint moved off to check on the other men, leaving Josiah alone with his troubled thoughts. As night fell over the battlefield, bringing with it a chorus of cicadas and the distant sounds of men settling in for the night, Josiah couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted within him. The cause that had seemed so clear, so righteous when he first donned the gray uniform, now seemed as murky and treacherous as the swamps they had slogged through on their march north. Dawn broke over the Tennessee hills, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold that seemed to mock the grim scene below. Josiah woke with a start, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle before he remembered where he was. The night had passed in fitful bouts of sleep, punctuated by the occasional crack of a musket as sentries fired at real or imagined threats in the darkness. As he rose, stretching muscles stiff from a night spent on the hard ground, Josiah's eyes fell upon a sight that made his breath catch in his throat. Not 20 yards from where he had slept lay a Union soldier, his blue uniform now stained and tattered. The man's face was turned toward Josiah, his eyes closed as if in peaceful slumber. Josiah found himself unable to look away, transfixed by the fallen soldier. He had seen the aftermath of battle before, of course it was an ever-present reality in this war, but something about this particular scene struck him to his core. Perhaps it was the youth of the fallen soldier, who couldn't have been much older than Josiah himself. Or perhaps it was the letter clutched in the man's hand, the corner of the envelope just visible, addressed in a feminine script to "My dearest Thomas." In that moment, the reality of war hit Josiah with a force greater than any physical blow. This wasn't just an enemy soldier. This was someone's son, someone's brother, someone's beloved. The letter in his hand spoke of a life interrupted, of dreams unfulfilled, of a family left to worry. Josiah felt a wave of nausea wash over him as he realized that he, too, could easily end up like this, a casualty on a forgotten battlefield, clutching a letter from home that would never be read again. "Harker, "Make yourself useful," Sergeant Grint's voice cut through Josiah's reverie. "We've got work to do and defenses to shore up. The enemy won't give us much respite. Mark my words." Shaking off his morbid fascination, Josiah hurried to comply. The day passed in a blur of activity, digging trenches, reinforcing barricades, and tending to the needs of his fellow soldiers. As he worked, Josiah found his mind wandering, questioning the purpose behind all this conflict and suffering. The grand cause of Southern independence, which had seemed so noble when he enlisted, now felt hollow in the face of so much hardship. It was late afternoon when a commotion at the edge of the camp caught everyone's attention. A group of soldiers was escorting a captive, a Union scout who had been caught trying to sneak past their lines. The prisoner, a young man with fiery red hair and a defiant glint in his eye, was brought before Colonel Beauregard, the regiment's commanding officer. Josiah, along with a crowd of curious onlookers, gathered to watch the proceedings. Colonel Beauregard, a tall, imposing man with a neatly trimmed salt and pepper beard, regarded the captive with stern disapproval. "What's your name, soldier?" the colonel demanded, his voice firm but not unkind. The prisoner lifted his chin, meeting Beauregard's gaze without flinching. "Private Michael O'Brien, 2nd Ohio Infantry, sir." "And what, pray tell, were you doing near our lines, Private O'Brien?" O'Brien's lips curled into a wry smile. "Just out for a stroll, Colonel. Thought I might take in the sights of your fine Southern hospitality." A murmur of disapproval rippled through the crowd at the prisoner's insolence. Colonel Beauregard's face darkened, but he maintained his composure. "You'll find our hospitality somewhat lacking for those who trespass, boy." Sergeant Grint. "Sir," Grint snapped to attention, his face an unreadable mask. "Take this prisoner and see that he's properly secured. We'll need to question him about his purpose here." Grint nodded grimly, a look passing between him and the colonel that made Josiah pause. As two soldiers firmly grasped O'Brien's arms to lead him away, the prisoner's eyes met Josiah's for a brief moment. In that instant, Josiah saw not an enemy, but a fellow human being, scared, defiant, and all too aware of the uncertain fate that awaited him. As O'Brien was led away, Josiah felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find Grint standing beside him, his expression unreadable. "Come with me, boy," the sergeant said quietly. "It's time you learned about the harder side of war." Josiah followed, his feet feeling as though they were encased in lead. They made their way to a small, dilapidated barn at the edge of the camp, its weathered boards offering little protection from prying eyes or ears. As they approached, Josiah could hear muffled voices from within, one raised in frustration, the other in defiance. Grint paused at the entrance, turning to face Josiah. His eyes, usually hard and unyielding, now held a hint of something Josiah had never seen before, regret, perhaps, or resignation. "What you're about to see ain't pretty, boy," Grint said, his voice low and grave. "But it's necessary. War ain't just about fighting on the battlefield. Sometimes the most important battles are fought for information." With that, he pushed open the barn door. The scene that greeted Josiah would be forever seared into his memory. O'Brien was seated on a chair, his posture defiant despite his bound hands. A stern-faced corporal stood over him, his expression a mix of frustration and determination. "Tell us what you know about your force's movements," the corporal demanded, his voice raised in exasperation. O'Brien glared defiantly at his captors, refusing to speak. Josiah felt his stomach lurch. This wasn't war as he had imagined it. This was something else entirely, something that stripped away all notions of honor and righteousness. He wanted to look away, to run from this place and never look back, but found himself rooted to the spot, unable to tear his eyes from the scene before him. "Sergeant," he whispered, his voice trembling, This can't be right." Grint's face was a mask of stone, but Josiah could see the conflict in his eyes. "Right and wrong don't enter into it, boy," he said, his voice barely audible. "This is war, and in war you do what needs to be done." As the questioning continued, each moment seemed to chip away at something fundamental within Josiah. The noble cause he had enlisted for, the glorious vision of defending hearth and home, seemed to crumble in the face of this harsh reality. He found himself wondering if the Union soldiers did the same to Confederate prisoners, if this cycle of mistrust and fear was doomed to repeat itself endlessly. When he could stand it no longer, Josiah fled from the barn, ignoring Grint's calls for him to return. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave out, collapsing behind an old oak tree at the edge of the camp. As the sun set on another day of war, Josiah knew that he could never again see the conflict through the same eyes. The enemy was no longer just the men in blue uniforms across the battlefield. The true enemy, the unforeseen foe, was the war itself and the darkness it brought out in men's souls. The following days passed in a haze of smoke and tension. The Union forces, seemingly undeterred by their previous setbacks, continued to probe the Confederate lines. Josiah went through the motions of his duties, his body present but his mind reeling from the harsh realities he had witnessed. The image of O'Brien, defiant in the face of his captors, haunted Josiah's thoughts. By day, he avoided Sergeant Grint's gaze, unable to reconcile the man who had mentored him with the one who had so casually accepted such questionable practices. It was on the 5th day after O'Brien's capture that everything changed. The pre-dawn stillness was shattered by the distant rumble of artillery fire. The Union had brought up heavy guns during the night, and now they rained destruction upon the Confederate positions. Chaos erupted as men scrambled for cover. Josiah found himself huddled in a shallow trench beside a fresh-faced recruit named Billy Calhoun. The boy couldn't have been more than 16, his smooth cheeks yet untouched by a razor. His eyes were wide with fear, his hands shaking as he clutched his rifle. "We're not going to make it, are we?" Billy whimpered, his voice barely audible over the din of battle. Josiah opened his mouth to offer some words of comfort, but before he could speak, a shell landed nearby, showering them with dirt and debris. When Josiah's vision cleared, he saw that Billy lay motionless, knocked unconscious by the force of the blast. Something snapped inside Josiah at that moment. The senselessness of it all, the waste of young lives, the brutality, the sheer futility, came crashing down upon him with the force of a physical blow. He knew then that he could no longer be part of this madness. As the bombardment continued, Josiah made a decision that would alter the course of his life forever. Under the cover of smoke and confusion, he began to crawl away from the Confederate lines. His heart pounded in his chest, every instinct screaming at him to turn back, to return to the relative safety of his comrades. But he pressed on, inch by agonizing inch, until he had put some distance between himself and the battle. Once clear of the immediate danger, Josiah rose to his feet and began to run. He had no clear destination in mind, no plan beyond escaping the hell he had found himself in. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs trembled, putting as much distance as possible between himself and the war. As night fell, Josiah found himself on the outskirts of a small town. Exhausted and disoriented, he stumbled into the train station, his uniform caked with mud. The station master, an elderly man with kind eyes, took one look at Josiah and seemed to understand. "Where to, son?" he asked softly, his voice filled with compassion. "Home," Josiah whispered, tears welling in his eyes. "I just want to go home." The old man nodded, quickly scribbling out a ticket. "Last train of the night leaves in 10 minutes. Platform 2. God be with you, boy." Josiah mumbled his thanks, clutching the ticket like a lifeline. As he made his way to the platform, his mind raced with the implications of what he was doing. He was deserting, turning his back on his comrades and his cause. If caught, he would face severe consequences. But the thought of returning to the front, to the endless cycle of violence and suffering, was unbearable. As he waited for the train, a commotion erupted at the far end of the platform. A group of Union soldiers had entered the station, their blue uniforms a stark contrast to the civilians milling about. Josiah's heart leapt into his throat. He turned away, trying to make himself as inconspicuous as possible. But it was too late. "Hey, you there?" a gruff voice called out. "Confederate." Panic seized Josiah. Without thinking, he bolted, running along the platform as shouts erupted behind him. He stumbled but kept running, adrenaline masking his exhaustion. By some miracle, the train had just pulled into the station. Josiah half ran, half fell into the nearest car, collapsing onto the floor as the door slammed shut behind him. The train lurched into motion, picking up speed as it left the station. Josiah dragged himself into a seat, his breathing ragged, his body aching from the day's exertions. In the chaos and darkness, the Union soldiers had lost their quarry. He sat quietly, listening to the rhythmic clank of the train on the tracks, each mile taking him closer to home. As the train clattered through the night, Josiah's thoughts turned to home. He thought of the rolling hills of his family's farm, of his mother's warm embrace, of the life he had left behind. The weight of his decision pressed heavily upon him, a mix of relief and guilt churning in his stomach. Dawn was just breaking when the train pulled into his hometown station. Josiah stumbled onto the platform, his legs weak from exhaustion and days of poor nutrition. He made it as far as the station's entrance before his strength gave out, and he sank to his knees, overwhelmed by emotion and fatigue. As consciousness began to slip away, Josiah saw the sun rising over the familiar landscape of his childhood home. A sense of peace washed over him. Despite the uncertainty that lay ahead, he had escaped the horrors of war and found his way back to where he belonged. In that moment, it was all that mattered. When Josiah woke, he found himself in his own bed, the familiar scent of home enveloping him. For a moment, he thought perhaps it had all been a terrible dream, but the ache in his muscles and the haunted memories that lingered told him otherwise. His mother's face appeared above him, lined with worry but filled with love. "Oh, Josiah," she whispered, gently stroking his forehead. "What happened to you out there?" Josiah tried to speak, but found his throat dry and his voice weak. His mother shushed him gently, pressing a cool cloth to his brow. "Rest now," she said. "You're safe." Over the next few days, as Josiah regained his strength, the reality of his situation began to sink in. He was a deserter, a fugitive in the eyes of the army he had once sworn to serve. The war still raged on, and sooner or later, it would catch up to him. It was on a quiet evening, as Josiah sat on the porch watching the sun set over the fields, that his father finally broached the subject they had all been avoiding. "Son," he began, his voice gruff but kind, "I won't pretend to understand everything you've been through, but I need to know, are you sure about this decision?" Josiah was quiet for a long moment, gathering his thoughts. When he spoke, his voice was steady, filled with a conviction he hadn't felt since before the war. "Pa, I've seen things, done things, that I can never unsee or undo. I went to war thinking it was about honor and duty, but there's no honor in what I saw, just suffering and darkness." He paused, swallowing hard. "I can't go back to that. I won't." His father nodded slowly, a mix of pride and sorrow in his eyes. "Then we'll face whatever comes together. This family protects its own." As the weeks passed, Josiah threw himself into the work of the farm. The physical labor was a welcome distraction from the memories that still haunted him, and slowly he began to heal, not just in body but in spirit as well. But the specter of the war was never far away. News trickled in of battles won and lost, of friends and neighbors who would never return home. Josiah listened to these reports with a heavy heart, knowing that he had abandoned his comrades. Yet each day, as he worked alongside his family to tend the crops and care for the animals, he became more convinced that he had made the right choice. It was nearly 2 months after Josiah's return when the war finally came to their doorstep. A detachment of Confederate soldiers, led by a stern-faced captain, rode up to the farm one crisp autumn morning. Josiah's father met them at the gate, his stance protective. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" The captain's eyes scanned the farm, finally settling on Josiah, who stood frozen in the barn doorway. "We're looking for a deserter," the captain said, his voice cold. "Private Josiah Harker. I believe we found him." What followed was a tense standoff. Josiah's father argued passionately for his son, speaking of the toll the war had taken on the young man. Neighbors, drawn by the commotion, gathered to support the family they had known all their lives. In the end, it was Josiah himself who diffused the situation. Stepping forward, he addressed the captain directly. "Sir," he said, his voice steady despite his racing heart, "I won't deny what I've done. I left because I couldn't bear to see more young men die for a cause that seemed to have lost its way. If you need to arrest me, I'll go peacefully. But know this, I've found more honor working this land and caring for my family than I ever did on the battlefield." The captain studied Josiah for a long moment, something shifting in his eyes. Perhaps he saw something of his own doubts reflected in the young man before him. Perhaps he was simply tired of the endless conflict. "The war's changing," the captain said finally. "There's talk of peace negotiations. Maybe it's time we all started thinking about what comes after." He paused, then continued in a louder voice. "We found no deserters here today, just a family working their land. Good day to you all." With that, the soldiers rode away, leaving a stunned but grateful Josiah and his family behind. As life slowly returned to normal, Josiah often thought back to his experiences in the war. The memories no longer haunted him as they once had, but they served as a constant reminder of the preciousness of peace and the importance of standing up for what one believes is right. Years later, long after the war had ended and the nation had begun the long process of healing, Josiah would tell his children and grandchildren about his experiences. He spoke not of glory or heroism, but of the true cost of conflict and the courage it takes to choose peace. The unforeseen foe, he would say, isn't the man on the other side of the battlefield. It's the darkness that war brings out in all of us. But there's always a choice. Always a chance to find our way back to the light. And in those words, in the peace he had found and the life he had built, Josiah Harker had finally won his own private war.